episode of Literary Gladiators, the show where we discuss and debate literature in all of its forms. If it's written work, it's game. Let's meet the panel.
Hi, I'm Larry.
Hi, I'm Austin.
I'm Tori.
And I'm Josh. Today we're going to be going over a novel that we have been looking to go over since season 4. We actually had it planned, but things took a different turn. But we are coming back to it, and that is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. And Austin will be presenting us with the discussion starter today.
Sure. So I know I mentioned this book in one of my individual videos. It's a book that I really like, and I had read it as part of a queer fiction class in my junior year. So there's a lot of things that I think could be talked about in this book. And some of the things I considered talking about were the use of flashback. I think the way that the book is framed with time is very interesting. I also was thinking about asking a question about why James Baldwin, who writes a lot about African-American experience, chose to make the two main characters of this book, which is kind of about queer issues, to both be white and set not in the States. But the question I want to go with kind of relates more to the setting and the idea of it not being set in the States, so it's set in Paris. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about location and the idea of nationality in this book. So I think there's a lot of times where things are kind of portrayed as either French or Parisian versus American. And that happens, I think, both with David, the main character, and Giovanni. And I think it also happens with David and Hella, which is his fiancée. So if we want to start talking about that.
I think as extreme as it may sound, I think that he wanted to approach each piece of diversity one at a time with regard to the black person and the person of LGBTQ backgrounds. I think that it was written in 1956, and at that time, being part of the LGBTQ realm was unaccepted at that time. And we were still in an era of segregation. So I think that including someone who was white made it more. I think that making the central character white would make it a bit more of, hate to say it this way, but a relatable issue to a wider audience.
Is he explicitly say that this character is white?
I think it's assumed because he's passing. You know, he tries for the masculinity, this, that, and the other thing. He explains himself as looking. Wait. My face is like a face you have seen many times. My ancestors conquered a continent, pushing across death-laden plains until they came to an ocean which faced away from Europe in a darker past. So I think what he's trying to assimilate there is, yes, he's white.
I think also Baldwin has been asked in interviews as well, because that was a discussion I remember having in class too, because there's one part where some people in the class, because when they explained Giovanni's makeup, and they were like, yes, he has darker skin and this and that. And so some folks in the class were like, oh, so Giovanni's black. And we're like, no, he's Italian. Like,
he's dark-skinned Italian. I mean, there are black Italians, but I don't think he's supposed to be black.
Yeah, no. And I've seen some interviews with Baldwin. So that's really... And I also think in some ways making the main characters white and setting it in Paris was able to say, well, now we can just get into the issue itself of sexual orientation, and that way we don't have to worry about, in 1956, what is going on in the United States on every front. You know, a lot of his works, Go Tell on the Mountain, The Fire Next Time, deal explicitly with race in the United States. And I think, in some ways, Baldwin also lived in France, and specifically in Paris. So
he was in Switzerland as well.
Yes. So I think this was, in one set, it was a natural setting for him to write about. You know, he understands Paris, and he can write about it from first-hand experience. But also, I think by setting it in Paris, there were a lot of other issues that he had written about in his earlier work, and other issues that I think he was just like, I now don't have to talk about that. I can get rid of those issues. I don't have to talk about race in the United States.
Kind of acts as like a controlled environment, kind of almost like a social experiment of, okay, let's take this and put it there. How is that going to develop? How is that going to evolve?
Well, I think what it's trying to do is it's trying to set up like different realms of location and kind of allegorically make them about different realms of morality.
Kind of like the metaphorical woods.
In a sense, yeah. I think in this case, though, we have America is kind of looked at as being kind of Christian and God-fearing, and Paris is more like a hedonistic kind of location where that's not even discussed, taken seriously, or thought about. Like, for example, the treatment of homosexuals in both places would have been very different, especially around this time. So where Paris would have had been more of like that hedonistic, and America would have been more like, no, we're more conservative. We're sticking with the values on which we've been based. I believe that's kind of what's going on here.
So I think that one of the things that's interesting is talking about Paris specifically. It was a city that I think had a different and wider acceptance of gayness than the majority of the United States in 1956. But what's also interesting is I don't think that means that people who were gay in Paris in 1956 were just like, I'm totally open with this and I don't experience any issues, right? So yeah, of course, and even in the book, there are bars that exist, and they can exist out in the open, and everyone knows it's a gay bar. They don't have to necessarily worry about the same type of issues in New York City in 1956, for example, where it was kind of like, people know it's a gay bar, but also expect it to be rated and things of that sort. But that's also not to say that like there weren't issues with being out and being openly gay, and I think that that's interesting. Another thing that I think is really interesting is I think that perhaps the use of place in this book, kind of along what Larry had said, is separating different moralities and also like kind of different, I think place and time, which time is a really important thing in this book, is told mostly through flashback.
Yeah.
I think it also relates to that, and in that America for David represents the future and the life that he is not comfortable going back to.
Yeah.
He's really anxious to get back with Hella. He's really anxious to hear what she has to say about his marriage proposal, and he just kind of wants time to stop. And what I think is also really interesting is Giovanni's room. Giovanni lives in a place that itself is called Nation, or however it would be pronounced in France, which means country or nation. So I think that's also really interesting how his room represents different things, but also even his time with Giovanni is kind of represented in this way of saying like this is his Paris experience, and he does not want to go back to his American experience, which isn't not trying to say that Paris is better than America or something like that, but I think it's just it relates to the time and the time where he was in Paris, even though he was dealing with all his own personal struggles. He was really happy with Giovanni, but also kind of was miserable and hated himself in a lot of ways.
There was a lot of self-loathing that was involved in that, and I think it kind of splashed into the descriptions of everything and everyone around him. It would start out with it being so great and grand and this, and then all of a sudden the gravity of the situation and the reality of what he was doing and what the potential. And I think that the potential energy and the potential of what things could have ended up trickling towards kind of made him throw on the brakes, and all of a sudden this maybe unconscious revulsion towards all of that kind of stuff slowly kind of permeated into the wording and the word choices used for all these different people, be it kind of just a benign like offhand comment about somebody, or really just sitting there and describing what he was seeing, and pulling out those negative traits in as opposed to like the positive. And sorry, I just wanted to wrap this up really quick. America versus like France. America a lot of the times was explained as being like progressive and new age and constantly moving forward, whereas Paris is very like languid, and the way that everything kind of happens is every night we'll see how it goes. So it was kind of like being able to take yourself out of this world where I know where my cookie cutter shape is and put myself in this world where I can mold my own personality. And then Hela comes in far later into the story, and it's that new world cookie cutter shape that I have to be, this masculinity that I know I must emulate, and applying it to the soft, volatile, fluid-like world that he had been suspended in for the couple months. Because he even explains like being with Giovanni was like being underwater, it was fluid.
That's
So I
where,
thought that was
yeah,
beautiful
I think,
visual.
The funny thing is, Paris is often seen as that the escape for creativity, as seen in that the Renaissance made mention to in Paris, where the creative minds all collected in that area and started to exchange thoughts, which I think that it's funny how America is often seen as being progressive, but progressive in what way?
Yeah,
Well,
Baldwin's-
I don't think that
Yeah.
it's in the case of this narrative. I don't think that it's about America being progressive. It's about
It's the
America
idealism,
having concern with the future,
Mhm.
and Paris not, and Giovanni
Exactly.
not because that's what he associates Americans with in that first conversation that they have. He's like, you Americans in the future, why does time matter? What does time matter? Because I think that he's looking to not think things through. He's not
He's looking
not
for a
looking
form
con-
of escape, yeah.
Yeah, he's just looking for whatever he can grab onto. Now that he's spit in the eye of God, basically, as he did, right before he left home. He talks about the woman that was his mistress. Maybe she was his wife. I mean, if this religion was so important and she was in his mother's house as a pregnant, it's kind of hard to imagine that they weren't man and wife. And then he spits on the cross when the child is born, stillborn,
when his child is stillborn, yeah.
and then goes to Paris. And I think that he gets that job as a bartender and kind of becomes half conscious player in this kind of perverse game
Pageantry, yeah. Exactly.
being run by the guy upstairs. What's his name?
Guillaume.
Guillaume.
Yeah.
I could not stand. Guillaume was a corrupt hypocrite.
He's the
It
worst.
was like the embodiment of every single aspect of
Evil.
homosexuality that David did not like.
Mhm.
I feel like he almost like made him into that.
And he took great
Yeah.
advantage of Giovanni. That's how Giovanni lost his
Absolutely.
job, is because he engaged in an affair with him, and in order to make himself look good, get rid of Giovanni.
And I wonder.
He's a nefarious element. I mean, like,
Yeah.
Yeah, as a person, he's not very nice.
And I think what's interesting too is going back to what you had said about how David kind of sees him as all of the things he hates, kind of in some ways about himself.
Yeah, exactly.
But he kind of Guillaume is not a good person, of course. But I also think pulling out some of the character traits that David pulls out and talking about who he is in this gay world in Paris is also a kind of way of saying, like, look, like, David's trying to say, look, like, gayness it's bad. Like, this is something I shouldn't do because I don't want to be this guy. When in reality, it's like, Guillaume's just he's not a good dude, regardless of
He's a jerk.
who he is.
Like, it doesn't matter if he was gay, straight, thought he was a plant. Like, he was a very, very jerky dude.
Yeah, and a manipulator.
He was manipulative. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he knew how to play other people for that. He came from a lofty family, so he was used to having that sort of life. Fell on hard times, so he would claw his way in any way, shape, or form. So the homosexual aspect of it was just an unfortunate afterthought through David's eyes.
He remained closeted, though. He manipulated the whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah, he would come in like in a suit and tie whenever he felt special or felt like he was like important, which was kind of referencing back to that like masculine mask, using that to his advantage.
And obviously, as in life, none of these characters is a perfect human being, and
No. They're humans.
I
They're
would say
shades of gray.
that's the greatest issue that I had. Granted, no, everybody's human, But I must honestly say, I did not like any of the characters in this piece.
Which is interesting because I kind of feel that. I remember the first time I read it, I was like, I like this book, but I also don't know how I like these people.
Exactly.
Well, that's fine too.
Yeah, and I recently had I watched the show Transparent, and during the second season, I hated every single character on that show, and it was very weird. I would like be watching the show, and I was like, I want to watch it because the story's interesting.
Yeah.
But I was also like, there's literally no, like at that point in time, I was like, these people have no redeeming quality.
I
That's
felt
the
the
same thing I
same
had.
exact way. Yeah.
James Baldwin is a brilliant writer, but yeah, I think that while David himself is a very, I felt that he was very not. I thought he was very self-considerate. I think that in a way,
Self-considered, what do you mean?
I thought he was a bit self-centered.
Self-centered. Oh, okay.
I think that
Yes,
he cared.
then yes,
he
we
cared
agree.
more about himself. But then again, he also surrounded himself with. I think Hella was just. The way that he described her.
Ella was collateral, like period end of story.
She cared about herself more than anything. She wanted to. She just
needed to.
She felt that her happiness was. Granted, we should all be happy people, but to her it was priority. Nothing else mattered.
The way that I see Hella is, like I said, she was collateral. Like she was looking for that white picket fence. She was looking for that American dream. She was at the very least looking for somebody she knew would be reliable. And when David first introduced himself to her, at the very least, her first pass, at first pass, he seemed like that. He seemed like the typical average American dude who's out and abroad, and she thought, okay, this is got to be a good guy. And as things progressed, I guess she started feeling the turmoil that he had within himself that he thought he had perfectly, controlled, and so she went away to think. We honestly don't know what she did when she was off on a lecture. Yes, she wrote, and I don't think we'll ever really, fully, truly know. I think she's a very, at face value kind of character, but she was kind of pulled down in his black hole. She wanted to have the happiness and stuff like that, and the more that he started to kind of, collapse in on himself, the more she was like, you know what? I just want to be happy. I want to be able to find somebody somewhere who at the very least is going to support me and be that typical. So now my dreams of being somebody who's going to be able to read books and do all that kind of stuff, I don't even care at this point. I just give me that idyllic house with the white picket fence. And I think that's what she finally compromised. And she was saying, I'll compromise. You can have your life. I can have my life. Just give me kids. And I think that's where she unfortunately fell in. And David just didn't like her because she was a woman. Didn't like her because she wasn't him. And again, she kind of got that broad brush that he painted with everyone around him of, self-revulsion, and reminded him of at least something within himself that he didn't like.
They definitely weren't a match.
No, absolutely not. I think it was just, I think he even says, something to anchor and something to tether himself to, and it was a wrong choice. And unfortunately, she got ensnared in the whole entire issue and got pulled down along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it's a tragic tale. The whole thing
Absolutely.
is very
It's
tragic.
a tragedy.
Nobody is wholly to blame and nobody is wholly absolved.
No.
But she was there too to discover herself. The way that presumably all these expats go over there, to find out what they don't know, right?
Yeah.
So she I think what she does is she kind of before she settles down, she wants to have one last kind of whatever
something
you
good
want
to think
call
about years from now.
Yeah, live out some Hemingway kind of,
Exactly. Yeah. Something romantic, something picturesque.
Yeah.
Just didn't happen.
Go follow the bullfighters and all, and then she found out this is meaningless, this is empty. I should.
She was basically
Get
a beard at that point, and she realizes that closer to the end of the story when she finds him in that one bar when they're together, the truth is put out on the table, and she kind of knew it for some time, and for this whole entire time she had been pushing that back. She had been grappling with it in a different way, but on the same path that David was.
As in, he had a greater preference for men.
Exactly. So, and that she was kind of he was using her as kind of this measurement, as less of a person, more of a goal, and that kind of got very, very in the way of their relationship.
I can see that being the case.
That's what it seemed like to me, at any rate.
To me, even Giovanni, he seemed very self-pitying in a way. He was always bumbling about how sorry he felt for himself.
Something that I wanted to point out there is in the story, David's name is almost never mentioned. And I'm not gonna lie, halfway through the story, somebody was like, "Oh, David," and I'm like, "Who the heck is David?" David's the narrator. Giovanni, on the other hand, will refer to himself in the third person a lot. People constantly mention his name. He's this bigger than life character that like takes up space. He is a person who just absorbs whatever is around him. People are enamored with him. They're infatuated with him. He takes over and becomes the center of attention. Not intentionally, but he becomes the center of attention wherever he goes. And I think that's a big point of contention too, is David trying to grapple with who he is, but now he's dealing with who Giovanni sees him as well. So Giovanni becomes this huge
And I also
magnet.
think that Giovanni is perhaps, written that way because that's how David sees him.
Exactly.
You know?
Again, that broad brush that David puts on it, that certain luster, that certain shine, quickly fades away because he starts representing that repulsive part of him. And I'm not saying that Giovanni is repulsive. I'm not saying that that lifestyle is repulsive. But the way that David looked at it, the way that David felt about it on his innermost self, he didn't like it. So this love of his life suddenly became the most tragic anchor and was weighing him down.
Well, yeah, and I think Giovanni, though, on his own right, is
I
also
mean, he
kind
didn't
of
know,
a needy and desperate character.
That's who's
Like-
needy.
Yeah, and it's
And
unfortunate until the very end when you find out his entire life story of how he got into Paris. It's just like this almost kind of pang of pity, but then at the same time you're like, I don't know if I should feel for him as much as I should as a human being. Like, I don't know. Everybody on this in this entire story is just like I want to feel bad for you, son, but
That's
there's always that
the
one
feeling I got. I think someone that I should be feeling bad for, but I don't.
sympathize for them, but you can't empathize for them. Well, at the very least, that's like it got to the point where David's words and David's thought process and his view started to obscure my view of the characters within the book, and I don't know if that makes any sense.
There's one character I felt bad for. It's Joey at the very beginning. He was the first one that he and Dave
Oh,
were
his
in.
friend, yes. Yeah.
He belittled him so much and called him a child. The way that he was laying was like a baby.
Yeah.
Just the name Joey itself, I think, was strategic.
It's innocent, it's childlike,
Joey's
it's
a
youthful.
baby kangaroo.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
that's
interesting that the father, at that point in his life, was kind of just like this womanizing, going through like this phase, I guess, of just sleeping with every woman. And his aunt was like, you can't live like that. So
But
in a way, that
his
kind
aunt, though, because the way that he described over the top, overdone, overdressed, wore too much makeup, was predatory, was dangerous in a room, especially filled with other people. Like he didn't like anybody from the start.
Yeah, that's true. But I think that goes kind of to the biblical idea of the knowledge of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in that moment, she says, "What you are doing is wrong," and he kind of obsesses with that. Knows that she's right, that it is wrong, goes to Paris, and then conducts himself in that fashion,
Exactly.
knowing that it's wrong. And I think that's the part that leads to hell, so to speak, is a kind of, what was it, like that creature that approaches him in the bar with no teeth and the crucifix.
the individual.
I call it a creature
The
because I
fancy
think
shirt.
I think he referred to this person as
As
something
like
that.
I don't think it's a
less than
person.
Not a
human.
person.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like a part of his own psyche, maybe. It could have been a hallucination, but
Very much so, yeah.
like, because I mean, it's kind of got like that Dickensian, like Ghost of Christmas Future kind of feel to it too, and he just says, if you do this tonight, you're gonna go to hell, and that's it. And he's like, well, what about you? Are you in hell? And he's like, no, I'm not in hell. Why isn't he in hell? Because he's just probably, like, from a Jungian perspective, he's just part of the psyche. That's very.
He's a Guillaume. Did I pronounce that right?
Guillaume.
Thank you. Sorry. He kind of again embodies that effeminate, the homosexual aspect, the stereotype of that, and he doesn't want any of that.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the two examples, too.
He really does, and it gets to a point where we're like, dude, oh my god, like I don't know, you just want to sit him down and be like, okay.
But it's also hard, reading this in 2017 and
Exactly.
being like, this was 1956. Like you said, you were kind of taught from a lot of people, a lot of different, institutions, whether it be from your religious background, whether it be from your schooling, from this. Like, you've been taught that, like, this is the worst possible thing you can do.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, so part of me is I'm like, yeah, like, it sucks that, like, you hate yourself, but also, I don't know.
I forget if it's Jacques or the other guy, where still, well, this kid David has a chance to maybe not go with Giovanni into this self-detrimental area, right? And he's like, this, you think that this is dirty. You believe that.
That's from the get-go. That's what he thinks, and I think that's the unfortunate aspect of the story is.
And you're going to do it anyway. I think that's the part that is kind of his undoing.
Hasn't
To
been.
believe that something is bad and to do it anyway. I mean, that's what sin is, really. I mean,
But I think that the thing is, you can't change who you are, and when you've been taught so much that, and you've internalized that who I am is wrong, you're gonna keep telling yourself that. But also, if that's who you are, like, it's very hard to not be yourself. And so, like, for David, I think that the struggle becomes, he's like, I think he realizes through the book that whether or not he's gay or at least bisexual, he's like, I shouldn't like other men, and here's all these reasons why. And I think that becomes his undoing. And that's one of I think the thing with the book is hurt people, I think, attract other hurt people. And I think that's why David and Giovanni, like, they're both have, like, really tragic backgrounds, and they're very hurt people, and the book ends very tragically.
Yes.
But I think that sometimes what can kind of suck about that is, I think hurt people attract hurt people, and but I almost worry that some people could have read this book, especially when it was published, and said, oh, see, like, look at how terrible it is to be gay.
Yeah,
And it's like, that's not what, in my mind, the book is trying to say. Of course, it sucks that all the characters in this book kind of have that experience, but I'm also like, I think that hurt people, and also that people who are like David, who's been told all these negative things, that he's now internalized, and having that kind of resentment for yourself, and also like suppression of your own identity, like
Because
can manifest itself in a lot of negative
it's
ways.
so self-destructive that even the fact of being with people that he loves, woman, man, it doesn't matter. The fact that he has to question and that grapple becomes so painful, he retracts even in more. He kind of almost implodes and causes the entire environment around him to become like just turned upside down.
he just keeps lying.
And that's the unfortunate thing is he's taught himself that to be a good person is to lie, and it didn't even matter if he was in the clear or not. Like, that was just his default, was from there on out, like trying to dig himself out of that
And then
hole.
of course that.
And Pops.
Well, I just wanted to say to Austin, like you were saying about like back in 1956 when this book came out, people would say, see, homosexuality is bad.
It's interpreted incorrectly, yeah.
Well, you mean, like, the question is, what is the future? Like, you see how terrified he is of what he will become living that lifestyle. What is the future there where that is not the inevitable outcome?
Well, I think the end result here, there's a lot of things I think that come into play. One is which, of course, he's like, I don't think I could be this person especially where I don't live in Paris. I'm here visiting. Where I live and where I grew up, like, I can't be this person because of societal issues, and that won't work. I think, but also, I honestly think that he has a lot of issues, but I don't think that his sexual orientation is an issue. I think it's what he tells himself about it, and how what he tells about himself about it, and then how that makes him act in this community is what is the negative here. I think when you're repressing who you are and who you're attracted to, and you're trying to hide that, I think that makes it easier to slip into a lot of negative and self-destructive behaviors. And so I think that's what happens with this book. And I think that's what happens, I mean, even with Guillaume, this, kind of this idea, like we said, he's a smarmy person in general, but also like this whole thing with Giovanni and trying to save face and be like, oh, that's not me. And it's like, I get, if there's certain ideas about what it means to be gay, you might not want people to look at you in that way or know that about you, but also like that at the end of the day is the problem. It's your own. It's society. How society's looking at you, and also your own feelings.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like actually your identity.
Yeah.
But of course,
Giovanni held back nothing. That's the whole thing. I think Giovanni's probably the most, he was probably the most open about his orientation, and he's probably the best example that you're going to get of someone who's confident about who they are during that period of time. I may have not been his biggest fan, but the way that he, I think that the fact that
He believes what he's doing.
he believes what he's doing and he holds nothing back.
Yeah.
So that is something that I admire him for.
Yeah, and that's an admirable quality. And it sets him apart from David, who believes that what he's doing is wrong. Giovanni believes what he's doing is right.
Absolutely.
Even though he's not very
David's very
helpful
insecure.
to David any more than David is helpful to him.
He's insecure, but he's also, to me, not a nice person.
No, I agree.
No, he's not a nice person.
But I
He's
don't.
very false.
Yeah.
Like he knows when Giovanni invites him into his room, pretty much right off the bat, he knows that he doesn't want to be a housewife. Right? He describes himself as, "What am I going to be here? Some kind of housewife?"
Yeah.
He doesn't want that. But it also seems like he doesn't know what he wants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's the end of the book, and I think that's the real tragedy is that, we are doomed to repeat ourselves. History is bound to repeat itself. So it's the unfortunate thing of he will never learn from all of these terrible mistakes because he's so busy self-repressing and like pushing everything away that I don't think he'll learn and be able to accept himself or find a different way to deal with that. And that's the true tragedy is that in a sense, like he dies as well.
and that's the scene when he rips the letter up. Giovanni throws it back to kind of say, "I'm leaving this behind,"
But then-
and the wind pushes it back to
Yeah,
say,
and it
"You."
even explains that,
you can't.
like certain pieces drift back to him. So that will always be a part of who he is.
Yeah,
I think that's the real tragedy is right there.
It's kind of like playing with the idea of absolution too. He can't be absolved.
Exactly. Because he won't forgive himself. Absolution, he searches for it from, I think, 3 or 4 different people. He says, I want them to forgive me, but that's like beneath them or beneath me, or he gives explanations. But at the very end, he never even sits down to look at himself. He constantly talks
Never
about
confesses.
mirrors. Yeah, he talks about mirrors and he talks about his own nakedness in a metaphorical sense, but he never gives himself that release of saying, it's okay. And I think that's, again, the biggest tragedy. Forgiveness, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that that's probably true. And it's weird because several times throughout the thing he says, "I want to confess," but always has a reason not to, or an excuse not to, either because he's not even sure what he's done wrong.
Exactly.
Already, how would you rate this book on a 0 to 5 scale with half stars permitted? Laurie?
I go 4.5 right now. I just finished it a couple days ago, and I can't stop thinking about it. So I mean, there's a lot in there, and I personally could talk about this book for another 3 hours, but time is a constraint, and
Great
but anyway,
things that books
that's it.
can do.
So, yeah,
Exactly.
there's a lot in this book, a lot to unpack.
Austin?
I said before, I'm just not good at rating things. I don't believe in rating, I guess. But I guess 4 stars because I still don't believe anything's perfect. I love it. It's a great book. I love Baldwin. Yeah, I mean, it's a great book. 4 stars.
I'd give it a 3.5. I normally don't like doing like in the middle stuff, but like I loved the way it was written and I liked the content. And it was a fascinating read. And like you said, I'm still thinking about it. It's still having me sit there and think, which I think is the purpose of a good book is to get you to think. But I can't get past the narrator and his self-deprecation and his self-destruction. And I think that's what made it really hard to read was how inflammatory he can become. So that's what I'm going to say. Is it's a 3.5. It's definitely a good read. It's definitely a thoughtful read, but it wasn't a personal favorite.
I'm in line with Tori. I give it a 3.5 because, just like Tori said, it was very well written, but I didn't like any of the characters. I think that not only was David self-centered, but I think that his self-deprecation caused him to be cruel to other people, and it really caused issues on the character front to crash and burn, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the theme that we've been talking about a lot lately, which is the whole responsibility and the idea that you're not inconsequential in the actions that you take.
But you also have to take into effect that this is written in 1956 and that it is about a subject that was viewed much differently than it is 61 years later. Alrighty, if you want to check out the book, here's my copy of Giovanni's Room. Tori's got the same version.
This is not sponsored by Chegg in what any way whatsoever, but thank you, Chegg.
But thank you for tuning into this discussion, and I hope you join us back for another episode of Literary Gladiators. For now, keep reading.